This video is the first in a series of 4 videos that explains the response paper assignments that you will complete in this class, beginning with this week. In this particular lecture, I will cover the basic requirements of the assignment. This will include an explanation of the following: the purpose of the assignment, how many papers you must complete, how you will submit your papers, the assignment due dates and where to find them, the structure and format of the papers, as well as the prompts that you will respond to when writing your paper. One important note before we begin. This video was made with documents and the Blackboard course page for a section of this class that was taught in the fall of 2021. This means that if you are not taking this class in the fall of 2021, then some of the specific information on those documents and the course page, such as the precise number of response paper opportunities and the due dates for those papers, may not apply to you specifically. However, all the general points I make in this video about the response paper assignment itself will still be relevant for you and for your section of the class. Now, to find out the precise due date for each response paper that applies to your specific section of the class, please consult the syllabus that is posted to Blackboard or the response paper guidelines document that is also posted to Blackboard. You can find the response paper guidelines document in the syllabus and course resources area of our Blackboard page. This document contains a briefer description of the points I will discuss in this series of videos, as well as a description of the essay prompts for each response paper assignment. When you open this document, you will notice that it has a linkable table of contents that will take you directly to where I explain each component of the assignment. So, in addition to contacting me via email, I encourage you to use this document along with the video that you are currently watching as a reference for any questions you might have about the response paper assignments. As I will explain shortly, you are required to complete 4 response papers over the course of the semester. Furthermore, this week in particular will culminate in you completing your first response paper assignment. Now, in order to do this successfully, it is important that you complete the readings for this week. One of these readings I will use as an example of how to write a response paper. That is, in the videos this week, I will take you through my thought process of how I would go about writing a response paper on this reading if I were a student. The article I will use to illustrate the process of writing a response paper is by Christopher Pines and is entitled 7 Arguments Against Extra Credit. This is also the first reading that you are required to complete for this week. The second reading for this week is entitled Download This Essay, A Defense of Stealing eBooks, and it is written by Andrew Forsheims. This is the reading that you will write your first response paper on, and this paper will be due at the end of this week. And again, for the exact due date for this assignment, please consult the course syllabus. My hope is that after completing the material for this week, you will have a better sense of how the points we learned about arguments and argument forms can be applied to understanding and analyzing philosophical writing. Specifically, the goal will be for you to become better acquainted with how to identify and outline arguments found in longer pieces of philosophical writing, and to gain an understanding of how to criticize and evaluate philosophical arguments. However, before we can focus on these vital philosophical skills, we first need to explain the basic requirements of the response paper assignments. And that will be my focus in this video. I want to begin by saying a few things about the purpose of this assignment. Stated simply, the purpose of the response paper assignment is to provide students with an opportunity to practice the skills needed to engage in close reading of a philosophical text, explain a philosophical argument, and criticize a philosophical argument. To that end, in these papers, you will first be required to provide an explanation of the reasoning or argument that the author makes in the reading, and then you will be required to criticize that reasoning or offer some reasons why the author's argument is faulty, invalid, or unsound. Now, one question you might have at this point is the following: why am I required to criticize the argument of the author I am writing about? What if I think the author's reasoning is sound? What if I agree with the author's conclusion? These are all good questions and they deserve a substantial response. The first thing I would say is that the reason I require this is not that I require you to actually think that what the author is saying is incorrect. You may very well find the argument the author makes persuasive and believe it to be completely sound reasoning. Rather, the reason I require you to criticize the argument is not because I require you to actually think in a certain way or believe anything in particular. The reason is because engaging with an argument critically forces you to think more deeply about it. If a student writes a paper agreeing with an author, the temptation will always be to essentially reproduce the author's thoughts with perhaps some complimentary statements about just how correct the author's claims are. One can, of course, agree with an argument after reflecting upon it in a deep and serious way, but in many cases, the temptation will be to simply take the author's point of view at face value. And if the purpose of this assignment is to train you to be able to critically evaluate a philosophical argument, then this approach really would not be very useful. Now, there is a further point to make here as well. Beyond the fact that criticizing an argument is a useful academic exercise, it is also an important skill for your own development as a thinker. In fact, I would point out that not only do I believe it is perfectly fine to engage in criticism of a position you think is correct, I would go even further and claim that doing so is a positive good. Doing so provides you with a great opportunity for self-development. But what exactly is this opportunity? To answer this question, consider the following famous quote that comes from a book entitled On Liberty, written by the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill. In that work, Mill remarked that he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good and no one may have been able to refute them, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Mill made this comment in the context of defending the right to freedom of speech. His point was that it is important to live in a society that permits freedom of expression because it is important that we hear the opinions of those who disagree with us. Notably, the point Mill was making here is not that freedom of speech is good because it can result in us being shown that our beliefs are incorrect when we encounter the opinions and arguments of our ideological opponents. Although this is part of Mill's case for freedom of speech, because Mill sees freedom of speech as essential for finding the truth. But in this particular passage, Mill is actually making a different point. Mill points out that even when we remain steadfast in what we believed before, that we still benefit from hearing arguments on the opposing side. In part, this is because if we have never encountered arguments against what we believe, then we have no real justification for asserting that what we believe is true. Yet there is a more fundamental point here as well. Mill holds that we cannot even truly understand our own beliefs if we have never come into contact with those who would criticize what we think is true. When we face criticism of our own beliefs, we are forced to think more deeply about them, to respond to the weak points in the arguments that we previously found so convincing, and to look at the world from a different perspective. Again, at times the result of this could be that we find our present belief to be lacking. But even if through such an encounter we remain convinced that our original and initial belief is true, that does not mean that everything is the same as it was before. By being forced to consider our worldview through a more critical eye, we come to better understand the foundation that worldview is built upon. We may now be able to spell out more clearly the reasons that support what we believe, precisely because we were forced to do so in an encounter with those who think differently. As such, confronting criticism can lead to an elevated and superior self-understanding. This is why, in Mill's view, those who believe something to be true without ever so much as considering the reasons that others may have for thinking differently not only fail to understand the perspective of others, but hardly even understand the rational basis for their own way of looking at the world. In addition to providing an excellent opportunity for self-understanding, the practice of taking a critical eye towards one's own beliefs can help us develop a healthy sense of intellectual humility that helps us better understand the perspective of other people. Think of any controversial, philosophical, religious, political, or moral issue. The kind of issue that quickly divides people into opposing sides and causes heated and seemingly intractable disagreement. The kind of issue that, when brought up for discussion, can quickly suck all the fun out of an otherwise pleasant dinner party or family gathering. In these cases, it is particularly easy to assume that those who disagree with us are either evil or they are stupid. Either they do not see the clear and obvious reasons for what I know to be true, in which case they are stupid, or they simply do not care about what is true and good, in which case they are evil. Now, this is obviously a very harmful and toxic way to look at our peers, but unfortunately, it is also all too common. Now, what is the remedy for this? Is there a remedy for this? Well, I think there is a remedy for this situation, but it requires self-discipline, curiosity, and a fair amount of humility. The remedy is an honest engagement with those who disagree with us. If we approach those who disagree with us in good faith, with the willingness to honestly listen to what they have to say, then it will be very difficult to castigate our opponents as either stupid or evil. Now, we might still believe that our opponents hold some false beliefs and are ultimately incorrect, but we will better understand their thought process. And if we see that they have legitimate reasons that lead them to sincerely disagree with our position, then it will be very difficult for us to think that they are either stupid or evil. They simply see the world differently than we do, and they have their reasons for doing so. When done well, such honest intellectual encounters can provide the basis for more harmonious relationships among those who disagree on questions of fundamental human importance. Now, to come full circle, we have seen that the response paper assignment may require you to engage in some degree of self-criticism, or at least of criticizing beliefs that you actually think are correct. I hope that you will view such instances as opportunities to deepen your understanding of your own worldview and gain a greater amount of sympathy and understanding for those who see the world differently than you do. What you are currently looking at is the first page of the Response Paper Guidelines document. Now first, let's discuss how many papers you are required to complete. There are 8 opportunities to submit a response paper throughout the course of the semester. However, you are only required to submit papers for 4 of these opportunities. So, which 4 papers you complete is up to you. It is up to your choice, with the exception of the following 3 qualifications. First, every student is required to complete response paper 1. This is the assignment that is due at the end of this week. This assignment is meant to be the culmination of the material for this week, in which you will learn how to explain and criticize philosophical arguments. Second, after you've completed response paper 1, you must complete at least one of the following 3 papers: response paper 2, response paper 3, or response paper 4. If you wanted to, you could turn in all 3 of these, have your 4 required papers all done, and then be done with the response paper assignment altogether. However, the requirement is that you complete at least one of response papers 2 through 4. The reason for this is to ensure that you complete at least 2 papers in the first half of the course. A primary objective of this assignment is to allow you to improve your work on the papers as the semester progresses and as you become more familiar with philosophy and with philosophical argument. And that just will not be possible if you wait until the very end of the semester to turn in any response papers. So this requirement just ensures that half of the papers you will write will come in the beginning portion of the course. Third, you are not permitted to complete any more than 4 papers. You are required to do 4 papers, but you can't do any more than that. For instance, you cannot complete 5 papers in order for a higher grade on your 5th paper to replace a lower grade on an earlier paper. However, you should keep in mind that a lower grade on an earlier paper is not necessarily going to ruin your grade in the course. Because philosophy is likely a new subject for many in the class, perhaps most or almost everyone in the class, my expectation is that your work on the earlier assignments will probably not be as good as your work on the later assignments. Furthermore, when I make final grade adjustments at the end of the semester, one thing I take into account is improvement on the response paper assignments. Those students who displayed consistent improvement on these assignments may be eligible to have a borderline grade bumped up to the next grade letter category. Now, let's turn to the due dates for the response papers. Each response paper has its own due date, and a paper will not be accepted once its due date has passed. Now, there are 2 places in which you can find the due date for each response paper assignment. First, you can consult the course schedule on the syllabus. For example, if we look at week 4 on the course schedule, we can see that response paper 1 is due at the end of the day on Sunday of that week. And if we look at the week 5 area on the course schedule, then we can see that response paper 2 is due at the end of the day on Sunday of that week as well. While there could be some rare exceptions to this, in the vast majority of cases, if there is a response paper due in a given week, then that paper will be due by the end of the day on Sunday of that week. However, again, for the exact due date for any response paper assignment, always consult the response paper guidelines or the course syllabus posted to Blackboard. The second place you can find the due dates for the response papers is on the response paper guidelines document itself. Currently, you're looking at section 5 of this document in the table of contents. You will notice that there is a separate area of the document devoted to each response paper assignment in the class. All the information you need about response paper 1 can be found on page 10, response paper 2 can be found on page 11, response paper 3 can be found on page 12, etc. Now, suppose you wanted to find out more information about response paper 1. You would simply click on the response paper 1 area of the table of contents. Here you can see that the exact due date for this response paper is listed in the assignment description. You may also notice that this is where you can find the prompt that you are required to write about for this assignment. I will not say more about the prompts at this time, since I will be covering that later in this video. Finally, I want to show you where you can submit your response paper assignments. In this particular case, response paper 1 is due during week 4 of the class. So, you will be able to find the submission area in the week 4 area of Blackboard. You will notice that you can also find the due date for the paper as well as a description of the essay prompts in this submission area. Now, to submit your paper, you will just need to click on the link for that response paper. This will bring you to an area where you can upload your submission as an attached document in either .doc or PDF format. Let's turn to a discussion of the format of your response paper. For this assignment, your paper must be at least 600 words. This does not include the title, section headings, bibliography, your name, etc. That means 600 words of actual written text. Also, notice that 600 words is merely the minimum requirement. You are welcome to go over 600 words. And while your grade could be penalized if your paper contained a lot of extraneous material that was not relevant to the topic at hand, I will not penalize you merely for exceeding any upper limit of words. The 600 word requirement is merely a floor, it is not a ceiling. Now, within that 600 word requirement, there are some further length requirements we should also mention. And in order to explain this, I need to say something about how your paper has to be organized. Your paper needs to be divided into 3 sections, and those sections need to be labeled as you see on the screen. First, there's the explanation section. Second, the analysis section. And third, a bibliography section. The first 2 sections, the explanation section and the analysis section, each have their own individual word requirement. Each of those sections must be at least 200 words. The reason for this is to ensure some semblance of balance in your paper. As we will discuss in a later video, the purpose of your explanation section is to explain the argument you are writing about, and the purpose of the analysis section is to provide a criticism of that argument. Both of these are important aspects of the paper. You would not, for example, want to spend 590 words explaining the argument only to just have a single sentence in which you criticize it. So, each of these 2 individual sections must be at least 200 words, but again, these are just minimums. You are welcome to go past 200 words, and in fact, you would actually have to go more than 200 words in at least one of these sections in order to meet the overall word requirement of 600 words for the entire paper. To make clear what the format of the paper should look like, what I have here is an example of what I would do if I were to write a response paper. And in this case, we're going to imagine that I was writing a response paper about this week's reading from Christopher Pines entitled 7 Arguments Against Extra Credit. Now, if I were writing such a paper, the first thing I would do is provide the basic structure of the paper. That means immediately placing section headings for the explanation section, analysis section, and the bibliography section. Having these section headings in your paper is part of the basic requirements of this assignment, which you will be graded on. And the reason I emphasize this is because having these section headings both will help you organize your paper more effectively, as well as help me when I grade, so I know precisely where to find your explanation of the argument and your criticism of the argument. As you can also see, I have included my name and a title for the paper. I have chosen to title this paper, "Don't Hold Me Back, A Defense of Extra Credit." This title indicates to the reader that I will be criticizing the argument that Pines makes in his article, and you will recall that the purpose of the paper, you are required to criticize the argument that you are writing about. So, when beginning to write your response paper, I would recommend that you begin by writing these exact section headings that you will then later fill in with the content that you wish to convey to the reader. The final thing I want to do in this video is make a few points about the prompts for your response paper assignments. I've mentioned a few times now how when you're writing a response paper, you are not just writing about the material in an abstract or general way, but you are writing about a particular reading, and furthermore, you are going to be responding to a particular prompt that I have provided for that reading. So the first thing to show you is where you can find these prompts for each response paper assignment. As I mentioned previously, you can find the prompts for the response papers in the final section, Section 5 of the Response Paper Guidelines document. For purposes of illustration, I'm going to start by showing you Response Paper 3. Now the reason I choose this for a first illustration is because, as you can see here in this description of Response Paper 3, there are two different prompts. There is Essay Prompt 1, and if we scroll down, there's also Essay Prompt 2. So of course you might wonder, well, do I have to respond to both of these or some combination of them? When there is more than one essay prompt, and sometimes there won't be, sometimes there will only be one, but when there is more than one essay prompt, you choose one and only one of those prompts to respond to. So in this particular case, for Response Paper 3, you would either respond to Essay Prompt 1 or you would respond to Essay Prompt 2, but you would not respond to both. What I would also like to do is walk you through a response paper prompt to show you how you can use it most effectively to write a good response paper and to make sure you understand all components of it. And in this case, I want to use the example of Response Paper 1, which is also the paper that you will be writing that is due at the end of this week. So here you can see that there is only one essay prompt, so there is no choice in this particular instance. You have to write on Essay Prompt 1. And in this case, this prompt refers to the reading by Andrew Forsheim's Download This Essay. So I'm going to read through this prompt and make a few comments about what you see here. So Essay Prompt 1 says the following. In Download This Essay, Andrew Forsheim argues that it is not morally wrong to steal books online. He explains the conclusion of his argument at the end of his essay. Let's conclude then explicitly with what I take to be the most interesting upshot of this argument. There's a kind of willful taking of another's property, stealing books online, that is not morally wrong. And if it is morally wrong, then operating or using a library is also morally wrong. So the first thing the prompt does is it indicates to you, in this case, the conclusion that the author is arguing for. And so, as I've stated previously, this means that in your explanation section, your primary goal is going to be explaining to the reader what is the reasoning or what is the argument that the author uses to establish this conclusion. And in the next sentence of the prompt, you see that I indicate that this is the case. In your explanation section, explain the argument that Forsheim makes for this conclusion. And then I provide you some questions to consider when explaining Forsheim's argument. For instance, how does Forsheim characterize what public libraries do? What are the reasons he identifies in favor of public libraries? What relationship does Forsheim believe that libraries have to copyrights that protect intellectual property? What reasons does he give for why the use of a public library is similar to stealing books online? So I want to make a point about what the purpose of these questions is. The attitude or the approach you should take is not necessarily that you have to address each of these questions, or even if you do address all these questions, that you have to address them in the same level of detail. The reason I pose these questions to you in the prompt is simply to help you think about the issue and to give you some guidance. I'm pointing out to you, here are some very important points or primary points made in the argument or made in the article that you should be thinking about. However, what you emphasize or what you focus on in the paper could be different depending on your particular goal, so you shouldn't think that you absolutely have to provide an answer to all of those questions. And in this way, as we will see later, the response paper assignment is different from the essays you will write for the exams. Okay, so the first part of the prompt really indicates to you what the conclusion is and gives you some questions to think about when you are explaining how the author argues for that conclusion. The prompt then concludes by saying something about the analysis section. So the prompt says, then in your analysis section, criticize the argument Forsheims makes here. And in particular, I would encourage you to consider the following question. Is the analogy that Forsheims draws between using public libraries and stealing books online a good analogy, or is the analogy faulty? So I've done two things. Again, I've re-emphasized for you that in your analysis section, you must criticize the argument you're writing about. The idea is to pose some problems for the argument. And then furthermore, I've given you a critical question to think about when criticizing the argument. Namely, is this analogy that Forsheims relies on between using a public library and stealing books online, is that really a good analogy, or are there some differences that really matter from a moral point of view? So that's what the prompt does. Tells you a little bit about what the author is arguing for, gives you some questions to think about, and points you in certain directions of how you might criticize the argument. A final important point is this. While the prompts do allow some latitude as to how you will approach the assignment, and different students may approach the assignment somewhat differently, you still want to make sure that you're responding to the specific argument identified in the prompt. While in this particular case, Forsheim's essay is not all that long, in many other cases, the readings we do in this class could be lengthier and contain many different arguments. So one of the purposes of giving you the prompt is to place your attention more narrowly on one specific portion of the reading and on one specific argument from that reading. This will allow you to go into more detail in your explanation and analysis and overall make your writing much more focused. As such, it is vital that when completing these assignments, you focus specifically on the argument that is identified for you in the prompt.